63A, the two dots, 5 lines, 25. Okay, so yesterday we discussed a number of things that have to do with how something is stated and what the implications are.
Your speech is garbled a bit. It's not clear with the devices you're using.
Okay, I think there's some gardening going on across the street here. Let me see if I can find another location. Okay. Looks like we're almost done. Okay, give me a minute. Is it better now? Is it any better?
Now it's better.
Okay. Let me know if it deteriorates again. Let's see what we can do. Okay, so 63A, 5 lines from. So Pshita, it is obvious that Amar Yachlo Kloni ben Achasai, somebody is probably referring to a deathbed or a will, basically a last will. Says that so and so should get a chelek, Yachlo. I'm going to translate split my estate. So Palga, so this is not the Yarshim, not the sons who would inherit in any case, of course, but a third party, an outside person. In the person's will, he says, so and so, I'm going to split my estate and split out my estate to this person. So Palga, that means he's giving him a half by using the word Yachlot, he means 50-50. So this person gets a half, and the rest of the estate, if they're Yorshim, they get the other. Now, what about Snu Chelek Uploni ben Achasai? He states as follows: give a chelek, give a portion. Now here, the Gemara is going to say that it's not so obvious that it means a half, right? So, what about this statement? Amar Ravina Bar Kisi, Ravina says, Tashma, let's find some support. This time you have a brisa. Give so and so a share in the water from my well. Sumplasomer and that means that you're giving him no less than a quarter. So in other words, we don't know if chelek means half or it means a portion, right? So the minimum that you could mean is like we're assuming you're gonna keep some of your own well water, right? So you're gonna keep half of it for sure. Now the other half is what we're unsure about how much you meant to give him. Did you mean to give him the whole half, or did you mean to give him half of that? Okay, that's how Gemara understands it. So since the minimum that you could have meant is half of that, a quarter, you get a quarter. Now, So what you get from that is if you say I'm giving a chelek, and that's the language used in this brisa, I'm giving a chelek, I'm giving a piece, then the guy gets at least a quarter. Now, l'chavis, what if he says, give this guy, I want to give this guy a share of the water in the pit for a barrel, meaning for this apparently means like for using for his animals. So then in Prachos Shminis, then we give him the minimum he would get is an eighth, because in this case, if it's watering one's animals, one would typically reserve for himself half of the water in the well. And so what are we talking about? Just the other, 1 second. Yeah, so we're only talking about what's available is half. If the giver were to reserve for himself half of what's available, that would be a quarter. In other words, a half of that half. What's left over is a quarter. And since we're unsure, we're going to split that into two and give him 1/8. Okay. Kedera, ain't Prachos Shminis. It's if you want to say I'm giving you water in the pit for the cooking, right? then it's a different method. How much water from your well would you typically reserve for yourself for cooking? A third, apparently. And so 2/3 is so 2/3 is left to give away, and half of that you're reserving for yourself for cooking, and so what's left is um, half of a third, and so you give half of that, which is a quarter of a third, which is a twelfth. Okay, and the tzviach, and if you say I want to give you water from my well for drinking, then that's even less because and talking to Shisha, so it would be 1/16 because um, the amount that you would typically use for drinking a quarter, reserve that half of that for yourself as 1/8. So what's left is an eighth to give away, and since we're unsure what you meant, we're going to split the difference and give the other guy a six.
Your speech is more and more garbled. It's really not clear the last few sentences.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you do. The only place I have available, and there's gardening going on across the street.
I'm sorry, what?
There's some gardening going on across the street, and this is the only place I have available on my home.
But is there are you using a
I'm using
device differently
earbuds.
or
I'm using earbuds with noise cancellation. Let me try a different setting. Is this any better?
that's a little better now.
1 second, try one more thing. Is this any better?
Yeah, that's better now.
All right, we'll use this setting. Thank you for pointing it out. Tanur Rabbanan. Moving on to a new topic. Ben Levi Shemachar Sadal Yisrael. You have a Levi and sells a field to a non-Levi. The Amrlo, and one of the conditions that he puts on it is Almanas Shemasa Rishon. I'm selling you the field, but I retain the rights to take the Maser. I'm a Levi, and I'm the Levi that you should give the Maser. So Maser Rishon Shalom, that works. That clause works. The Imamar, but if he says me ulabanai, not only me, but my heirs after I pass, they will continue to get the maser. Then when that happens, when he dies, then the buyer still has an obligation to continue giving the maser to his estate. And if the condition is, as long as you own this field, you have to give me the maser. So what can the buyer do? The buyer goes ahead and sells it to somebody else and then buys it back. So it wasn't his for a time. So like that clause about as long as you have it, you have to give me the master that expired. Now the guy goes and buys it back again. So Amor then he no longer has a claim. The lady no longer has a claim for the master. So it's a good guy. Gemara says, am I? Uh, why in the first place? Like, what's the principle here? Why should this lady be able um, to acquire? I mean, in his field in the first place, but he's acquiring future benefits, maser from crops that haven't grown yet. You know, got maser with formally on them. Maybe you can't acquire something that hasn't yet that doesn't exist yet. Once is Caleb the Amalei Almanasha Master Lucian Philly, you're excited Ramonko Master. Because what he's actually doing is he's reserving a portion of the field itself, right? So Master is 10%. I mean, let's just consider 1 year for the purposes of illustration. Master is 10%. So when I sell you my field, what I'm effectively doing is retaining 10% of the land for myself. Uh, Effectively, that's what I'm doing by saying I get to keep the matzah. Um, so, okay, all right,
It's
got
very
that. So,
difficult to hear you. The last, it's
all right, I'm
so
gonna
much
see if I can find
interference.
another
It's
room.
just getting harder and harder. It's just not.
Okay, stand by. I'm going to see if I can find another room. Okay, undoubtedly this will be better. Yes, can you hear
Yes,
me?
very much better. Can you just
Excellent.
summarize in 2 sentences what the last section of the Levy was, maybe?
Yes. Okay. So let's just back up. Um, let's
And
back
Tana
up to
Rabbanan, I
Tanarabana.
completely
Tanarabana.
lost him.
Yeah, it's fine. Tanarabana. Ben Levi Shemachar suddenly Israel. If a Levi sells a field to a non-Levi, Yarmalo, and he adds a clause, Almanas Shemaser Rishon Shali. Um, I on condition that I get the maser from this field. Okay, maser Rishon Shali, that works. And if the clause is, the stipulation is, I and my children after me will get the maser, mace, and the lady, the seller dies, Yitin Lavan, the children, the estate still is entitled to that maser. If he says, I get the maser as long as you own this field, so then what does the buyer do? He sells the field to somebody else. The clause expires because he's no longer owning the field, and then he goes and rebuys it from the third party. Then he's gotten out of the clause. He no longer has to give the maser. Where says am I? Like, what's the whole principle here for this whole scenario? We have a principle that you can't sell something that doesn't exist yet. So here you're selling like future maser from future crops that don't exist yet. So how is it that the Levi can acquire the seller is kind of acquiring the future maser? Because what's happening here is it's as if he's saying he's reserving a piece of the land for himself. So for the purposes of illustration, I mean, Maser could, this could go on for many years, but let's just say Maser is 10% for the purposes of illustration. So when he sells the land, he's saying, I'm selling you 90% of the land, effectively, by saying I'm reserving the Maser for myself. Okay, so we're interpreting what he's saying in a way that makes it legal or makes it possible to implement this clause. Okay.
But doesn't the Meister change based on the amount of crops he raised in a given year? It's 10% of his crops, not his land.
Right. Right. So
So that this is
so
a
what the Gemara
fluctuating
seems to be
value then.
right, and also there's multiple years, right? It's not just 1 year master. It could be how many years could it be until the guy dies or till his heirs die or whatever, right? Um, so I guess the idea is that he's saying whatever percentage of the land includes the future value of the maser, that's what I'm reserving for myself. Okay, so you don't have to actually spell it out. We're just interpreting. When you say this clause, I get to keep the maser, right? The future maser. What you're saying is, I'm reserving however much of the field uh, the the value of that future maser is. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Rish Lakish, so Rish Lakish says, Zosamaris, we can derive from this, if you sell a house, and you say, Almanascha diuta initially, that the diuta is apparently the rooftop with a fence around it. Okay. That I get to keep that. That works. So so in other words, like what's the issue here? We know that the Mishnah had told us already. The Mishnah that we're working on is the seller keeps the rooftop anyway. If he says I'm selling you the house, if he doesn't make any other stipulation, he gets to keep the roof. So what is the purpose um, of uh, like what is Reish Lakish telling us that um, that um, so we interpret it that the seller keeps some extra rights, and what is that? Lemay help us. So what's Reish Lakish implying? Rav Zvid says Shima Ratza Lahosi Bozizi and Motzi. But what if you want to grow string beans on the roof? And the nature of the crop is that it's going to stretch out into the airspace outside the roof. So ordinarily, we would say the owner of that roof doesn't have the right to infringe on air rights, if you will, of the neighboring property or of outside of the roof. But by saying Zosomeris, by Reish Lakish is saying, this interpretation means that we will interpret this extra stipulation, which is extra unnecessary stipulation. That is, I get to keep the roof. We're going to interpret it as I get to keep the roof, with including the proviso that I can grow my beans even if they stick out of the airspace. And Rav Papa says, that if you want to build a second story or a third story, whatever, on top of it, you can do that. So you can retain the right to rebuild the roof if it falls in. So Bishlam Rav Zvid, I understand according to Rav Zvid with the beans, like that makes sense. If you're trying to understand what Reish Lakish is interpreting from the case of the Maser, right? Because he's saying, look, what does the Maser case show us? That we interpret what the guy says in a way that's beneficial to him. Okay, so we interpret what he says about the Maser, even though saying that future Maser I'm keeping isn't effective because it doesn't exist yet, but we're interpreting it in a way that allows him to keep it, right? So that here too, with the beans, even though the clause doesn't specifically specify this extra use of the roof for the beans, right? But because he stipulated it unnecessarily, would otherwise be unnecessary, we're going to interpret it as this is what he wanted to add by using this clause. El Rav Papa, but Rav Papa, who said that means that you can just rebuild the roof. My Zosomeris, like, what are you implying from the rice? I said, where's this kasha? Yeah, Rav Papa's answer is not such a good, good answer.
So he's keeping this extra. Anyway, I'm a little confused.
Okay?
There's an extra roof. There's an extra section above the house. That's the roof with. So the person is not selling that. He's keeping that for himself, right?
Right.
And then is extending something over into the airspace of the person below to whom he sold it. Is that it?
Yeah. So the question is, okay, so if you hadn't made any extra stipulation, would you get to keep the roof? Would the seller get to keep the roof? Yes, he would. That was our Mishnah, right?
Yes.
Now, when you say I'm selling you the roof, and I'm selling you the house, and I'm keeping the roof, right? What does that mean? I'm keeping the roof. Of course, you're keeping the roof. We know you're keeping the roof, right? You wouldn't have to specify anything. So what Rish Lakish is saying is, because you added that stipulation, I'm keeping the roof, we're going to interpret it in a way that adds some property right to you. And that is, according to Rav Zvid, that what is that extra stipulation? Beans, right? You can grow beans and they'll stick out into the airspace outside of your roof airspace, and that's the condition that you added with your extra clause. With me so far?
Yeah. So
that's what Rav Zvid says. Rav Papa says, no, that's not what's implied. What's implied is that you can rebuild the roof, but if it collapses, apparently that's what it means by building another story. Like if it collapses, you can rebuild it, but that's not an extra right. Rav Papa doesn't make any sense in interpreting Reish Lakish, because that was a right that's also included. There's no extra right being included by saying, and I get to keep the roof. So the Gemara concedes, yeah, Rav Zvid makes more sense, right? The beans theory, that what you're adding on is the right to grow beans, that makes sense. But saying that I have the right to rebuild it if it collapses, that doesn't add anything. That's also implicit in the sale in the first place. So that's why the Gemara essentially rejects Rav Papa.
All right, okay.
Amar Rav Dimi Narda. Rav Dimi said, Haiman the okay. Tsarich lemichtav le kani lemitom ara avad rom rakia. In order to really get anything underneath, let's say there's a cistern underneath the house, or
Wait, there was your system froze that from Amar Rabdimi in our
can you
dam.
hear me?
I do, but then it froze
Oh,
for a
okay.
while.
Okay. Amar of Nimi Narda. I'm on the Mizbon Basel Chavre, somebody who sells a house. And as it will turn out, there's a cistern underneath the house. So we're going to discuss, is it what is the cistern included? So even if you wrote in the contract, I'm selling you the house with what's above it and what's below it. Okay. Sorry, in order to include the cistern, sorry, actually, what I'm selling you is from the center of the earth to the, to the sky. All that is yours with the house, and that's the only way to explicitly or include the cistern under. In other words, just saying what's underneath it is not deep enough, right? As we'll see, the Gemara will explain. My tama, the umka varuma bistama lokani, because selling the house in the first place is just the house, nothing underneath it, and nothing above it. Ahane umka varuma. So when you add the clause and what's above it and below it, sorry, excuse me, lamikna umka varuma. That includes space above and space below the house. But how much? Not that much, right? So it, like, let's say it allows you to dig a little tunnel under the house, or let's say you want to add you need to do some plumbing work and you need to install a drain pipe underneath the floor. So that's included when you say, I'm selling you the house and what's below it. In other words, enough space for a pipe, but that doesn't include a whole cistern underneath it. In order to include that, in order to include a cistern or everything underneath the house, you have to say like to the depths of the earth. So Lema Masaile, maybe there's a support for Avdimi from a Mishnah, which is actually the next Mishnah coming up. Below Sabor, below Sadus. The Mishnah says if you sell a house, then you haven't sold the cistern underneath it. Alpha Even if you specify you're selling what's above and below the house, right? So this is exactly Rav Dima. And if you think that just selling the house includes something underneath it or above it, so then by adding a clause, you must be including a cistern, right? Anything under the house. Where says the Lord constantly? No, maybe not. Maybe the Mishnah means where you hadn't written anything. You could say that that the that according you could say that according to the Mishnah, adding the clause umkavaruma could mean the cistern, so it's not conclusive. But the Gemara says afal pisha kasel. But wait, but the Mishnah says even though he wrote the height and depth, right? So you're directly contradicting what's actually written in the Mishnah. Talking about this is what it means. Alpha pisha kasel low. Kamisha kasel dami. We're filling in the words of the Mishnah. Even if he didn't write the extra clause, it's as if he wrote it. Lamika umkavaruma. In other words, a plain sale without any stipulations of if he had stipulated umkavaruma was above and below. Limik number and one second. Limikne bor vedusa mechilos ikasav le umkavaruma chane. But in order to buy the umkavaruma, the what is above and below, then if he wrote it, then you get the cistern. Lokas and lokana. You could say that the Mishnah is, in other words, the point of the Mishnah is even though a straight contract without any stipulation is enough to get this some space above or below the house, it doesn't mean the whole cistern. Okay, so in other words, like even though the Mishnah seems to be according exactly with Rav Dimi, the Gemara says, well, maybe not necessarily. We could kind of read it a different way. Tashma, let's try
So it
another
says
proof for
ikatav le'umka v'ruma kane, right? That's what he's saying.
yeah.
If he so that
That could be what the Mishnah means. So the Mishnah
that it
could
would
be,
be
yeah, that you would need um, that umka varuma could mean all the way down, including a cistern.
alpha biachi. The Rashbam at the end says alpha biachi lo kana. Well, what's he say?
You
Ani
could say
lo
that that's what the Mishnah is saying.
right. Who alpha bi lo
It
right.
seems like the Mishnah is exactly like Rav Dimi, but the Gemara is saying, oh, you could read it a different way. You could read it that the clause umkavaruma really includes the
Right.
cistern.
Right.
Yeah, not like Rav Dimi. So it's not a proof against Rav Dimi. It's just like this Mishnah doesn't necessarily support Rav Dimi. You could read it two different ways. Tashma, let's try another proof. Again, the same Mishnah. If you sell the house, just like I'm selling you the house, no other clause, the roof is not included if it has a fence 10 tfachim around. Okay. Now, if you think that just like Rav Dimi, that if you're selling just the house that automatically includes the space above and below at Kigavasar my have then like what's the difference if it's 10 tefachim high or not, right? So the Mishnah could be seen to show that Rav Dimi is right, that if you buy a house, you don't automatically get the space above it unless you specify umkavaruma. Right? So why is just Kevin de Chashiv? No, it's because if there's a 10 tefach fence around it, that changes it, right? So even if typically you would get the airspace above the roof, in the case of this Mishnah, that there's a 10 tefach fence around it, that's when he would agree with Rav Dimi. But without the fence, the Mishnah would not agree with Rav Dimi.
Suggesting
Okay, again,
that he could get the roof, even if he
right.
said it was enough. He said Uma Varumka, and there was no fence. He gets the roof. The buyer gets the roof, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Our living Ravashi. Tashma, here's another proof. Yam Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says, Zo Samara, Samav Bryce Lahavero, Vyamarlo, Manasha Diotel Yanashli. This tells us, the Bryce tells us that if you sell a house and you say, but I'm keeping the rooftop with the fence around it, I'm keeping it for myself, you tell then it works. And we said about that, Lamai Hilchasa. This is what we just saw earlier.
So this is not the roof. This is just an upper section, right? He said this is different than roof. The
Yota is the roof with a fence around it, apparently.
I don't know. I'm thinking it might just be
No?
an attic, like a second floor, an extra structure on top. I don't know if that's because we just discussed the roof with the makan, right? I think it's another case. He's talking about, we talked about this before. It's an upper section, another piece of the house.
Okay, you could be right. I'm going with the Art Scroll translation, but what you say makes sense. Yota, let's see. Okay, I'm not sure. Okay, you could be right. Okay, let's say that's fine. So we'll call it an attic then.
I don't know. It could be a second floor,
Okay.
another story, whatever.
Okay. Anyway, if you sell the house and reserve the attic or the second floor for yourself, that works. Do you tell Yona Shalom? What did we say about that Lamai Hilchasa? What is this teaching us? We said before that what you're actually reserving, since you would get to keep the second story for yourself without specifying anything, then the specification allows you extra rights of growing beans. And Rav Papa Amar Shim Ratzah Livnos Aliyah Gabakabona. And we saw that Rav Papa says that Reish Lakish means that you have the right to build on it. Now, if you think that without this extra clause, without any extra clause, you would not, you wouldn't get like you wouldn't be selling the second story anyway. Lamali almanas. What's the purpose of this clause? Well, answers Hanile almanasti nafil hadar banile. What you're saying is not only do I have the right to the second story, but if the house collapses and has to be rebuilt, I have the right to rebuild the second story for myself. That's what the extra clause could mean. And
We
will
said
stop here.
earlier that was a kasha. The Gemara, that was Rav Papa's answer, and the Gemara left it as a kasha. Then it was difficult to understand.
Right. So we didn't think that Rav Papa had it right, but Rav Papa said what he said. So Rav Papa's statement appears to back up Rav Dimi. Now, do we accept Rav Papa's statement? No, we still thought that it wasn't it seemed like it wasn't correct, as we said before. Anyway, the Gemara leaves us in somewhat of I think, a bit of an inconclusive place, but that's as far as the discussion goes. And David will pick up from the Mishnah tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, have a good day.
Good day.